Well, I'd like to thank your professor for inviting me out here today. My name is Abiathar, and my father is the high priest. And my dream personally is to follow in my father's footsteps and to be the high priest over all of Israel. I just could imagine one day putting on that robe of scarlet and purple and following in my father's footsteps. My father would pull me alongside sometimes as I grew up as a child and tell me stories, and he'd say, "Abiathar, you have in you the royal blood of the priesthood. Your grandfather's grandfather was Eli." And I'd say, "Yes, Father, I know. And he said, "But you know what happened to Eli's sons?" "Yes, Father, I know. They were wicked." I said, "That's right. They took what wasn't theirs. They took the offering from God." "Yes, Father, I know. They took the offering from God and used it for themselves. And you know what God said to them?" "Yes, God said he will honor those who honor him, and he will despise those who despise him." I'd recited this over and over and over. My father told me one day he'd finish telling me that story. Well, my dream to become high priest is a dream I've had for a long time. I wanted to be the man who would walk into the Holy of Holies, to offer the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, to be there and to be in the presence of God in front of for my people. And I'm sure you have dreams too. I'm sure you have dreams about maybe having a family or a position. There's two paths that we can take to achieve our dreams. I hope my story about how I became high priest, will help you choose the wiser of these two paths. I want to share with you 24 hours that changed my life forever. 24 hours that changed the course of the history of Israel forever. It's 24 hours before I became high priest. You see, he came at night. And men like him, they live at night. They love the darkness. And I was right about to just set my head down and fall asleep when I heard a bellowing in my village of Nob. And I was there with my family, and there was this loud, obnoxious voice coming outside late at night. And nobody was doing anything. Everyone was just waiting for my father, Ahimelech, the high priest, to do something, because they all looked to the high priest to take care of situations like this. And well, my job as the son was to greet visitors. So in the middle of the night, he says to me, "Abiathar, go and greet our visitor." So I got out and I stumbled over and I see a man with a horse. And I walk over to him and he's singing a song, and he's singing, "Well, David has killed his thousands, and Saul has killed his 10,000s, and David has killed his thousands, and Saul has killed his 10,000s. And I walk over to him and I'm thinking, who's singing? I'm like, shh, keep it down. It's late at night. And I look at this man, I'm like, "You're not even singing the song right." That's what I think in my head. It's David. David's the great one. And he goes, "Who are you?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm the son of the high priest. My name is Abiathar." And he says to me, "Is this the way that you greet the mightiest of Saul's herdsmen? I am Doeg the Edomite, and you send me a son. Where is the high priest?" And I said to him, like, "Well, it's late at night, and he's sleeping, but I can help you out. I will get you to your room." "Well, take me to my room, and also I need you to take care of what I brought in. You see, I've had a great hunting expedition, and I need to go in quickly and get my rest." Well, sir, I look back, and I see that only an Edomite would do what he did, as he brought in unclean animals that had been killed on the back of his horse, 3 rabbits. And as a high priest, I see the blood, and I think, I may become unclean doing this. "Well, take me to my room, young man, and take care of my great feast." So I take him to his room, and I look at what he's brought me. But luckily, I have a skill in ropes and knots as I make a crafty net and take those animals and bring them outside where I placed Doeg, the Edomite. And it was as if Doeg was just thriving off the tension that exists between our people and taking a little bit of joy in seeing me have to follow his commands and even take care of unclean animals. You see, these Edomites and us as Israelites, we had a long history of tension. Ever since, well, the Edomites are from Esau, and Esau lost the blessing to Jacob, who we draw our heritage from. And even when Moses was traveling through to get to the promised land, the Edomites would not let us go through. And even at that point, Saul, our king, defeated the Edomites recently. And this is probably where he got to know Doeg. And there was this great tension. I could tell that Doeg was getting a little bit too much excitement out of making me take care of his animals. And I thought, I'll just do this and get this over with, and hopefully Doeg will be gone in the morning. So I set aside his stuff and went to bed. 16 hours before I became high priest, I woke up that morning, and he came at first light. Another man approaching. And he came into our town, and I began to walk and approach him, as was my job. But my father was there, Ahimelech, and he held me back, and he said, "Hold on, son, I recognize this man. This is David. This is one of Saul's greatest warriors." And I got excited. I always wanted to meet a great warrior. I've always heard of David and the song about, yes, he's killed the 10,000s. Yeah, that song that Doeg sang backwards. And he said, "But something's wrong, son. A great warrior like this doesn't travel by himself." And I could tell my father was nervous. He said, "I'll go out there with you, son. Let's see what David wants." As we approached David, we came up to him, and my father asked, "Well, greetings, David. Well, why do you come alone?" And David said, "Well, I come in haste on a secret mission from the king. I left quickly, and I came here in need. Do you have 5 loaves of bread or anything that you can give me?" My father seemed pleased with that answer, that made sense. After all, David did do many missions for the king. He said, "Well, David, we do not have any bread right now to give you, but we do have the bread of the presence, but it is a holy bread. We can only give it to you if your men have remained holy and pure and have kept themselves from women." David replied to my father, he said, "Well, I always consider my missions holy. What I do for God is always in view of who God is, and we've kept ourselves pure, and we will take that bread." And I spent the next couple hours with David and learning with David, and together, my father and I, with David, inquired of the Lord about his secret mission. We inquired upon God to see if God would bring him favor. And I learned from David that this was something that David always did. He inquired before God and wanted to know if God was with him, if God was for him, if God was going to bring him success. And he always strived to honor God in all he did. He would honor God on every one of his missions, always remaining pure. As we were finishing inquiring of God and spending that time together in fellowship with the Lord, I heard something. "David has killed his thousands, and Saul has killed his 10,000s. And I look over, and there's that Edomite singing the song of David backwards just to strike a little nerve. And David says, "That's not the way my song goes." And he looks over, and with one eye sees Doeg. But he doesn't flinch. He just looks at my father and says, "Do you happen to have a sword or a spear that you carry here?" You see, in our little village of Nob, we didn't have weapons. We were high priests. We didn't fight battles. But we did have one. My father says, "We have the sword of Goliath, the sword that you used to cut off Goliath's head, and we keep it in the holy place. I can go get it for you." And David said, "Give it to me, because there is none like it." And with his one eye on Doeg, the Edomite, and one eye on us, and sharing in this last fellowship, he took the sword and rode quickly to the south. But Doeg caught sight of him. And though he was just up, he staggered around and immediately rode off to the east. And I remember thinking, and my father and I looked at each other, something is going on. The day passed. 12 hours before I was to become high priest. A man came riding in the afternoon. As my custom, I came out to greet him. He was in Saul's garbs, and my father also came out too, knowing that things weren't always as they seemed, and things were beginning to get more and more uncertain. He said he was a messenger from Saul, and he had a summons for us. He read the summons that King Saul is summoning the high priest to meet him in Gibeah. And I thought, the high priest? Well, which of us gets to go? And the messenger said, all of you get to come. The king is summoning you all. And I got so excited. Not only did I get to meet David today, but I'll get to meet the king of Israel. And my father spread the news. He told my uncles, he told my brothers, he told my cousins, he told my nephews, and we gathered up and packed up all our donkeys, all 86 of us, to make a trek to see the king in Gibeah. We got on our donkeys and began the journey to ride out to see King Saul. And I remember just in my excitement, I wanted to know more about this man I was getting to see, and I kind of careened my donkey over to the messenger, and I said, can you just tell me more about this king? I want to know who I'm going to meet. And he said, well, Abiathar, I wouldn't get too excited. You see, the king is about half the man I say he was when he first became king. You may not have heard the stories, but God charged him to kill the Amalekites. He told them to bring them to utter destruction and not save a thing. But King Saul was afraid, and he saw how good the fruits were that were left behind by the Amalekites, and he saved sheep and the best of the oxen, and he even saved the king himself, Agag. But Samuel brought judgment and told him, you weren't supposed to do this, Saul. Samuel himself killed the king Agag and told Saul, you're going to lose your kingdom. But Saul refused to hear it, and he said, no, this is not going to be me. Then came on the scene the young man David, and we thought this was a great thing, and so did Saul. David brought many victories, but then that song that you've heard made Saul grow extremely jealous. The fact that Saul had only killed his thousands, but David had killed his tens of thousands. Saul tried to kill David in his very own house. And you know who helped him? Who helped David? The one who helped David was Saul's own son, Jonathan. I couldn't believe this news. That the king's own son? So, he began to tell me again, time after time, now Saul was on a pursuit. He was on a pursuit to kill David. He was on a mission to kill his right-hand man, his own son-in-law, David. And the messenger began to tell me that when he left Saul, he was in his lowest state he'd ever seen him. That he stood behind a tamarisk tree and wailed in front of his own Benjamite people. He said, why? Why is no one helping me? Why have none of you even told me that my son is conspiring against me with this son of Jesse? Why do none of you feel sorry for me? Why is no one giving me their hearts and their ears? I can give you, the son of Jesse can't make you commanders. The son of Jesse can't bring you lands. But I am your king. He was a broken man. It was then that someone did step up and give him what he wanted to hear. Doeg, the Edomite, came before the king and said he saw David. He saw David at Nob, at your village. And he saw David receiving bread, receiving the words and instructions about his battle, that you sought the Lord together, and that he received the sword to do battle. And that's when the king decided to summon you. We rode the rest of the journey in silence. 1 hour before I became high priest, we arrived at night. It was up on a tree. There was guards, the king's guards, on each side, 100 or so of them. Torches lit up and shined off their armor. And Saul stood at the top of that tree, holding on to his spear, leaning over as if in weakness, as if though he wasn't wearing his armor, he was carrying a burden that was too heavy for him to carry. My father sat an arm's throw away from him, and we lined up on the sides. And the king said first, he said, tie them up. Tie their hands and bind their feet. And they bound up our hands. It was a simple hitch knot, and they bound up our feet. Again, a loose hitch knot that I was fairly familiar with. With our hands tied, the king began to speak. He said, Ahimelech, to my father, why have you conspired against me with my enemy, the son of Jesse? Why have you given him the bread? Why have you given him a weapon? And why have you blessed his mission against me to seek the Lord on his and give him victory? But Ahimelech, my father, said, this is David. I inquired the Lord for David. This is David, your son-in-law, the one who has enjoyed fellowship with you, the one who has married your daughter, the one that has served you faithfully and won battles for your name. Is this the first time that I've inquired for the Lord for David? No. But why would you impute this guilt on me? Why would you give me this guilt for something that I knew nothing about? And Saul said to my father, he said, Ahimelech, for conspiring against my enemies, you will surely die today, you and your entire family. Guards, draw your swords. And standing there, the guards drew their swords. Knowing I was in danger and knowing my knots well, I slipped right out of my ropes but held them in the back of my hands. Ready, we looked at the swords that approached us, and I saw my father and looked over at him, and he was the noblest of men in this situation. For he trusted in God with all his heart and knew God would accomplish his purposes. And Saul shouted out, "Kill them! Kill them all!" And we closed our eyes, and we looked, and we waited. And I looked over to my father, and not one guard had lowered his sword. And I thought, we've been saved. Like the moment of Isaac right before he was struck by Abraham, we had been saved by faith. We had been saved. And the guards threw down their weapons and said, "King, far be it from us to kill the royal priesthood. This will not be on our hands." And they took a step back. The king was enraged. His eyes lit up. His voice bellowed, and he said, "No, this is not how this is going to end." And he looked around, and there was the man that we had become familiar with just the day before. "Doeg, the Edomite," said the king. "Kill them." Doeg came from out of the darkness and walked up to my father. And I thought, here it is. He raised his sword, and with one swift motion, he cut my father down, and I screamed out, "No!" My arms were free at that moment as I dropped my rope, and I had an instant to decide to run, and I felt drawn to my father who lied there down in the ground, who was bleeding. And Doeg raised his arm again, and it was as if an invisible hand pushed me and held me back and said, "Run, run." And I turned, and in the confusion and the screams of horror, I ran. I ran as hard, and I ran as fast, and I ran as quickly as I could, as if the wind of the Lord was at my back. My lungs burned, my tears were streaming down my face, and I heard the screams. The screams of my uncle, my cousins, my nephews. I ran harder than I ever could. I ran as long as I ever could through the night. I came to a point when I needed to decide what to do. I could go back to my people at my village, but I knew if I went back there that Saul might be closely behind me. I needed help, so I went south to David. I knew he was down there, and through divine influence, I met up with him. It was late at night. It was actually morning. Right at that twilight period of change, when David said to me, after I told him my story, he said, "Stay with me. The one who seeks my life seeks yours. You'll be safe with me." And we wept. We wept. 85 priests were killed that day. 85 of my family members. And we learned that Saul didn't stop there, but he went to my home. He went to Nob, and he killed my mom, my sisters, every child, every animal, every ox, sheep. He killed. The very thing he wouldn't do to the Amalekites, he did to his own people. He brought them all underneath the sword and killed them. As the last one, I became the high priest for my people. And I think now you see why it's a day I'll never forget. It's the day my dream came true. And it's the day that the royal priesthood was almost annihilated. If there's one point, one statement that could be made to bring clarity to this madness, it's through looking at the eyes of David and Saul. David received through obedience what Saul couldn't take through forceful defiance. David received through obedience what Saul couldn't take through forceful defiance. You see, David received from God. He received what he needed, the bread, the sword. He even received the support of the high priest, as we once supported Saul, and now that transferred to David. And you see what Saul wanted. Saul wanted, he wanted the respect of his people. He wanted the support of his people, but he couldn't take that. He also wanted to be king, and he couldn't take that either. Through his forceful defiance, he could not take what he wanted most. We too, we can receive through obedience what we can't take through forceful defiance. We have two paths to choose when there are things that we want that are not within our grasps. We can be like David and honor God in what we do, seek him continually, and align ourselves with him, inquire of him continually like David did, and follow that path to receive what God has for us. Or in forceful defiance, going against God, seeking shortcuts and methods to get what we want, we can bring destruction like Saul did. I experienced the destruction of what happens when people in defiance try to get what they deserve. That story that my father never finished about Eli and his two sons began to ring more clear as I learned the end of it. You see, Eli's two sons forcefully took what wasn't theirs in defiance. And because of that, because they were stealing from God's offerings, stealing of the meat offerings, stealing of what belonged to God, God cursed them and the family of the priesthood. And he said, one day, he said this to Eli's sons, one day, all of you will be wiped out, but one. But one, and that one will wail in grief and weep and hurt. I experienced the destruction. I was that one. May we be a people who receive through obedience and not be ones who take through forceful defiance.